Quick chat about the paint while I'm doing it. Lots and lots of this cheap Georgian De Laroni student quality paint. So stuff I use a lot of, titanium white. I tend to get the cheaper ones. Haven't really noticed much difference in quality. I use a lot of Sea White's paint. So this is Sea White Cobalt Blue. It's a hue, so it doesn't actually have the cobalt in it. I find this to be actually stronger than real cobalt blue. And as I say, the Sea White's paints seem to be excellent. A very good friend of mine told me to paint like a millionaire, squirt out more than you'll need. Not really sure about that one. French Ultramarine. Use quite a lot of this stuff by Michael Harding, King's Blue Deep. That's the colour of snow in shadow, buildings in shadow. Wonderful stuff. Which I can't get the lid on. Lots and lots of burnt sienna. I probably use more colours than I should. Every now and then I strip back to primary colours and start again. But lots of these colours seem to find their way back onto my palette. This is Michael Harding Naples Yellow. It's quite dark for Naples Yellow, but it's lovely stuff. I use that in mixes. Crimson Alizarin. Again, cheapo Georgia stuff, but I found it to be just as good. And Cadmium Yellow, which is my primary yellow mix for greens, grasses, etc. Am I missing any? No, fairly sure. So titanium white, I've got the Michael Harding white, warm white, cadmium yellow, Michael Harding Naples yellow, crimson alizarin, burnt sienna, French ultramarine, cobalt blue, King's Blue Deep, and the new stuff I'm playing with is phthalo blue and zinc white mixed together. It's quite a fake looking blue, but when mixed with yellow it gives you a kind of vibrant green. I'm going to start with some mixing, so I'm very quickly knocking up some of the colours I think I need. There's an awful lot of green. As with all aerial photos, you end up with more land than sky. Standard green is French ultramarine and cadmium yellow, and then I'm going to stick some of this phthalo blue and zinc white in. And that's kind of base green, so mix up a ton of that, and then out of that take a big scoop. I'm going to stick and make myself a much browner green with a bit of burnt sienna, and again take a big squirt of that, and then I'm going much darker, so a big helping of French ultramarine. And more burnt sienna, stick a bit of crimson in that, crimson alizarin, and that's going to read dark. The more French ultramarine, the more dark blue you put in, the eye will read that as black. I don't ever paint with black paint because I just don't feel the need. And you find if you mix, the fewer colours you use, when you come to sort of mix them together, they'll hang together a lot better on the painting. If you've got more out of the tube colours, you tend to find yourself wrestling, making colours work with each other. So I've got a lot of different browns in there. Start again with my beautiful reddy brown burnt sienna, and there's quite a lot, so I'm going to use my Naples yellow, tiny tag of French ultramarine. I'm going to lighten that up with a bit of white, give me a standard kind of very light golden yellowy brown. So that's probably enough. Because we've got a sunset picture, there are no whites in it. All the whites are very heavily tinted with a sunset yellow. So this is working out the highest key of pale I'm going to use. Is going to be titanium white, bit of warm white, cadmium yellow, and then using my other yellowy browns in there, mix that one up nicely. And then the last thing is a bit of blue for the sky. Always used to use just cobalt for skies, and the sky's never that colour, so I'm using a bit more of the phthalo blue, King's Blue Deep, cobalt, and then to read it properly you need to stick quite a lot of white with it on a little separate area, and that's pretty close I think, so I'm going to leave those two areas together. So remember, if you're using any yellowy colours like we've got in these clouds, we've got very, very yellowy, orangey, white clouds. Stick any yellow on a sky and it touches the blue and you end up with a green sky, which is the biggest indicator that the painter wasn't paying attention. There are no green skies in nature, so be aware of that one. Make sure the two don't touch each other, or if they do, make sure there's enough browny orange in it. So I'm going to start sketching out with a oil acrylic filbert brush. Just take some of my darkest value. I think they call this breaking the surface. You just sort of let the brush wander around on the canvas, really. It's not really anything more scientific than that to it. But while you're doing this, your brain is doing quite a lot of thinking. And I'm looking for the shapes, so I just kind of start with the darks. Yeah, previous sketch of this, I've moved the road. It's kind of, if you knock it into thirds, you probably know about 1/3, 2/3 composition. I want the thirds of the painting to be interesting. So I'm going to have my farm over here. It's Bevendine Dairies, just off Bevendine near Brighton actually. So this probably isn't making a lot of sense at the moment. And what I'm going to do is grab some of my sky value, put in the blue of those hills. I'm setting that high key, those very light values. Things that are further away tend to have a lot more blue in them. And I'm knocking, a bit too much. I'm knocking that distance back there. So I'm going to grab myself a fairly large chunky, this is a Sea Whites number 14 filbert, kind of hog hair scrubbing brush really. Take a bit of brown in there. I'm still using just my dark value. Stick a bit of blue in with it. And this is the town in the distance. That's way too dark. Oops. There we go. And I'm sort of carving out that hill, that middle green hill that's catching the sun. And then much darker in the foreground is our farm, which is sort of that shape. Again, I'm just messing with really big blocky shapes at the moment. Just really scrubbing it in. There's not a lot of thinners in this paint. I'm working on a primed canvas. They come primed from the shop. This is a 40 by 30, I think, from Sea Whites. Comes primed in white. I then go over it with some white gesso, which is the really chalky stuff, with a little bit of Payne's grey acrylic in it. Gesso's acrylic, and I put a spoonful of polyfiller in, which is a tip I nicked off Brian Ryder. Superb video if you get a chance to have a look at it. And that gives it a slightly lumpy key. Right, there's a couple of shapes that I really want in that farm there. Lots of energy in the strokes. Hopefully some of that will come through to the final painting. That's, as a shape, kind of got most of it going on in this third, that's good. And then we've got big boring field, much darker boring field here. These lines in the crops I'm going to use to lead your eye up to this farm. Everything I want to say is in this farm here. And then again we've got a little bit more distance going on, which I'm just going to scrub in with a bit of cobalt blue. And now we can start scrubbing or scumbling some greens on. They're very yellow greens because they're in sunset. So there's that golden hour. So I'll just paste a little bit on and see how I feel about it. This is a very yellow high key green, but I can tell from that whether I've hit the middle of the value and whether I need to go darker or lighter. So I tend to find darker foreground leading you into the interesting stuff happening, like a sort of vignette effect on a photograph. Tends to work very well with seascapes. Not so sure about fields. This is really dark. This is almost all shadow going on down there. Not to lose the edge of that road. I can go a lot darker than I need to go, because I can always bring it up. You start working dark to lights with oils mostly. The sun coming now, it's throwing all my colours. So let's find some of those highlights, those highlighted greens. This is my sort of real interest, is those highlighted, almost summery crop greens. This is a winter photo. Took it 2 days ago with a drone. So that's quite high key. And darken it down a little bit less interesting from my background. And again, there's another hill there. God, that looks a mess. Alright, so just trying to describe some of those hills in the background as well. Bear in mind, the higher up your camera is, the less lumpy the landscape seems. Right, now I think I'll put the bones of a shape. So what I'm going to do is just rinse my big hog hair brush out, find some of my highlighted yellowy browns, mix them with a bit more white, and I'm going to start describing those lines. Not quite that leery. So I reckon that is one of my lines in. And this is the road down to the farm. Tarmac's always a strange one, because tarmac is never black when you actually look at photographs of it. We've got the white of a building. I think it's a white building, but it's very yellow in that sunlight. So I'm just going to mark on where I think that goes. And then there's no other colours in there. We've got lots of these very yellowy, reddy browns to the buildings. Let's just mark a couple of those off where I think roughly they go. And then we've got a couple of lights in shadow. Now, white when it's in shadow goes blue or lilac, and you've got sunlight going on one side of it. So I'm going to use the sky colour I mixed up earlier, just to show me where those whites are that are shadowed. There's the front of a gable there. There's a couple. And a couple of dots. I'm sort of trying to balance the composition more than looking what's actually there. So again, we've got some whites in that town there. I'm just dabbing in, just telling my brain these are where houses are going to go. So again, we're going to get that very yellowy high key value. That's just where these houses up the top are catching the sun and starting to describe that town. That's probably wrong. I'm using some cobalt blue, just to describe the shadow in that. Yeah, that's it. Now it's not that blue in real life, but it's a trick on the brain. Using blue is telling me that it's a shadow and it's far away. When I come to view this from a bit further away, I'll move the camera back in a minute. That should make a bit more sense. Still looking for those darks. So I'm taking a lot more of this dark value and sticking a bit more green in it. It's quite a yellowy green. And I'm using my darks to cut out those initial lights. And some of this orangey colour, just to break up those in foreground darks. A bit more yellow, a bit more Naples yellow in there. Okay, so we've got this road starting to work. I need to pick it out with some shadows now. Foreground's still a complete mess. This field over here is still deeply uninteresting, and I need to block in some of those colours. Bit thicker paint, more vibrant. I'm going to do that using some of this polar white nylon, very, very soft brush. So soft brush is excellent for laying wet paint over already wet paint when you're working a la prima like I am today. So I'm going to find a bit more of my mid value on those mucky greens that I mixed up earlier. These are going in the foreground. I don't want you to focus on the foreground, so nice big coverage, quite wet paint, got a lot of thinner mixed in with it. It still surfs nicely as long as you don't play with it too much. And then I'm going to find that really dark shadow. Stick a bit more blue in it, make it darker. And I'm laying down the shadow of that road in the foreground to bring your eye in. Tell you more about the subject in the centre. Those shadows are coming across. So that's really starting to sort of poke now. Always a bit nervous about using shadow. You can go over the top and you end up with a really dark, glum painting. So I'm just sticking a bit more blue in there to make the shadows a bit more interesting. And that's a really hard line. It's broken because it's got vegetation all the way over it. But there we go. It's starting to say something now. Not sure what it's saying. And again, that shadow. There we go. That road's starting to work a bit now. Let's put a bit more cobalt in. Some of this shadow can go into the foreground just to cover up the undertone. Alright, that seems to be working quite nicely. Just going to knock the paint out on my rag and stick in some of that really high key grass, winter grass down the side of that driveway, the road down to the farm, just to see if I can get it to sing against the shadows I've just put in. It's definitely a lot browner than that. Right, again, thin it down a bit. Need to move my thinner pot now. I've got a camera sitting in the way. There we go. Yeah, alright. That seems to be working. Saying quite a lot with just a rough brush stroke. It's quite fun, that. And some more on to the side. Make sure it's the right size of shadow. paint for this. I'm probably going to go over this field in the background, so I don't want to put too much in there. And a lot of my stripes are highlighted with a bit of sunlight. Right, while I've got my big flat brush, I'm going to knock in some more of these hills. Again, starting with the darker value, and using it, I'm going to sort of start to chop the shape of the farm out. This big dark blue shadow, and as I'm further away, I'm using a purpley blue for that shadow. Just whacking it in with my big soft brush. It's wet. Okay, and there's another shadow there. I'm using all the lines in these fields to lead your eye into the composition. I've got a shadow on the farm. I'll use a bit of ultramarine because I want a darker shadow there. Okay, that's starting to work. And some big old shadows in the foreground. A bit more French ultramarine. Remember, your eye reads blue as a shadow as black when it's placed next to all these other values. Yeah, that's starting to work. Now I really want to pick this hill out with a much higher key yellowy sunset green, so I'm going to stick a load more of cadmium yellow in and half a brush full of white and a little bit of my burnt sienna because it's got that yellowy brown colour. There we go, yeah. That's just where it's catching the light. Careful not to naff my other shadows up. That's a much paler highlight because it's gone further back. So I'm just using a pretty dried out brush and I'm blending in some of my shadows and just trying to balance the painting correctly, get those values right. So things that are further away lose their saturation. So just bear in mind, everything's a bit more black and white the further away it is. I'm sure that's Zen, metaphor for life or something. And then way back in the distance, very high key, much paler fields. That's starting to make a bit of sense now. Tidy up this big foreground field. There's a pole, electric pole, a couple of them, and I'm going to beef up the shadows that aren't really there because that works quite well, especially when you're doing these aerial paintings. While I'm here, I'm just knacking? I've invented a new word, I'm knacking. I'm dabbing some shadows in to the foreground, into my farm. You've got these shadows lancing across the field. I'm going to put one or two in. They're probably going to come out because I haven't finished the field yet. But that kind of works. Start to chisel out the farm a bit more. And for that I'm going to use another polar white. A bit smaller this time because we're only working small, so this is 5/8. We went metric 30 odd years ago, but we're not allowed to use millimetres. So using my smaller flat brush and my dark value that I mixed up, I'm just going to pop in the house and define these lines a bit more. Define these bits of farm. Trying to make them make a bit more sense. So I've got all the values right, but I've not actually done really any sketching. So we've got a tree in. Use the side of the brush for the tree. And they set off nicely now. I've got that field value working right. By value I mean intensity of colour. There's lots and lots of very dull videos on YouTube about getting values right. Sadly they are absolutely necessary. That's Collie Wisson. If you get a chance to look at Collie Wisson's videos, do so, they're amazing. He came out with a beautiful one, I don't know where he heard it. Values do all the work, colour gets all the credit. So, just dabbing in some trees, some interest. Blobs, basically. It's mostly blobs. So I'm going to stand back. The angle on this field is a little steep. I'm going to just cover up the last of that primer, and then I'm going to work on the angle of this field because it's not that steep. And it's picked out beautifully with a bit of this high key orangey brown colour. Just catching the sun on the way in, and it brings you into the farm nicely, like that. Definitely a bit more red. I'm going to put a little bit of my crimson alizarin in there. Just to show me where the highlights are. We've got an interesting thing happen over in Bevendine. We've got some lovely light catching all the trees down into the valley there. So mixing that colour up about right. They're winter trees, so they're all orangey brown. And showing how the further away the vegetation appears to flow down into the valley, it's catching that sunlight. There's a bit more orangey, reddy colours up in the houses there. Okay, I've stood back, had a good look. It's these fields here that need sorting out. Again, the shadows in them need to be kind of darker but uninteresting, because I want everyone to be looking at the farm. So, by knocking these back with some of the darker values, hopefully I can say something about the sunlit highlights on the top. That's probably about right. Not even done, I've done nothing to the far distance. Now I'm going to rub in a rough old sky, because now I'm going to be using those colours to work on the rest of the painting. So a bit of clean rag, slightly cleaner brush. This is, love Rosemary's brushes. Oh, this is a number 8 classic filbert from Rosemary. Wonderful lady. She's got lots of other ladies making brushes, Rosemary's brushes. If I could afford them, I'd have all of Rosemary's brushes. So I'm looking at a kind of purple, light blue purple. Too much juice in that. There's my cloud. Oh no, it's not actually that colour, but it's a start. Blue for the shadow under the clouds. I know I've lost my horizon line, I'll find that, get that back in a minute. And then over the top of that, we've got a much paler, take some warm white and some of that yellowy white, I'm making a line, a sort of fire break between my purple clouds, and I'm going to go up into blues here, the cobalt blue of the sky. Now, again, my white isn't entirely white, it's got a bit of orangey brown in it. You've got to be really careful. If that blue touches a yellow up in your sky, you're going to end up straight away with a green sky. It's a firm rookie error. So I'm using a lot more of this phthalo. I'm mixing the phthalo into my blue. I'll rub that on the top. Oh, that's Larry. That's really quite bright. I'm scumbling that in. Perfect hog hairbrush for this. And then I'm sticking a load of white with my King's Blue Deep and a bit of cobalt. That much gentler value down here, light blue. Now, blues get much more intense in colour the further up the sky they go. Right over your head they're really dark, cerulean. Further away they get whiter and lighter till they get to the horizon. It's always paler in the horizon. Don't think there's any exceptions to that rule. So I'm starting with my whites down here, and as I work my way up I'm blending up into my Larry blue and knocking that back in the process until it looks a bit more natural. Now I've got this mental cloud going off just above the farm, and I want it pointing to the farm really. I'm pointing into this bit. So again, just jab it on there so I know it's there and search for the shadow underneath it. I'm going to go back on this later. Is that too loud? That sort of works. A bit more blue in it maybe. A little bit of purple. Pretty much put any colour you like in clouds as long as it's not green. Alright, so I've got some wispy clouds going over here. So that's got the feel of the sky about right. I'm going to choose one of my softer acrylic filaments just to lay in the highlight, because that's going to be possibly the brightest thing on the picture. So again, a soft filament. I'm just going to get a big handful of that high key, very yellowed white, soft white, just so I know where the top end is. I can judge the rest of the values in the picture. So, and a couple over. Now, I need to find my highlights again. This time, I'm actually looking to describe buildings properly. So I'm going to choose a very small polar white, 3/8. Soft polar white, and I'm going to pick up some more of this warm white, my yellowy colour, and I'm knocking my paintbrush around in the paint with my thinners until I've got just the right consistency. This has got to be fairly runny because it's going over very wet paint now. It's the corner of that barn which is the one that's catching the sunlight. It's going to be a rough old brush stroke, but if I get it in the right place, your brain should tell you that is the front of a barn. There's something there as well. There's some uprights just catching. Really tempted to put some more in than that's actually there. I'm going to invent a new barn just because I want something else. Now, that's as far as I can go with that. So I want the front of this foreground house, which is actually there. I'm going to move it over a bit, stick a bit more red in there. And I'm going to chop it out using more shadow. So again, this is really sticky shadow, but showing me where the edge of that house is. That was moderately unsuccessful. There we go. Well, I've got that going on and that's working. Let's find the other side of that highlight. Now those deep shadows can only be cast really by man-made buildings. So now I'm starting to describe the buildings. A bit of foliage and trees, but mostly buildings. Let's have a look at the side of the farmhouse again. And wrestling is a real fight with these fields. There's a groove where the tractor driver was rolling a fag. And then a much higher value yellowy orange colour. Just picking out the sides of these furrows. Now, the last thing I want to do is stick some sky blues to describe the shadowed side of white containers and things in the farm. So possibly a little high. Right, I've given it a good coat of looking at, as my father would say. Now I've got a big splodge of blue on my brush. Oh, yeah. Right, I need to sort out some of these shapes. Because they're not quite working. I want that to be a continuous hill, really. And then this shadow in the background. That needs to be a separate hill. That works. That's a happy accident. And then I need to lessen the angle of this foreground hill. Picking out the shadows as I do it. cobalt to put some shadows in that hill. There's some big old shadows going across. Trees or houses or whatnot. Oh, there's some nice ones there as well. Those big blue shadows are what's telling you that the sun's low. I'm going to knock in some more of those highlights now, try and brighten that distant Bevendine up. The shadow line's about there. And got lots of these very blue shadows on the sides of the buildings. Seems really wrong when you put them in, but it should work. There you go, they're starting to look like square buildings. We've got lots of them down in the shadows here. Make sure no white creeps in because that is all blue. There's no sunlight getting down into that bit of the valley. Not that time of day anyway. I'm sure they do have sun in there.
I heard you got some rookie parking permits.